Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us this morning at our session on bringing COP to Yorkshire. We're just waiting for one more of our speakers to come through, but I will kick off with the introductions. So my name is Anita Lloyd, and I'm a director in the Environmental Safety and Health team at Squire, Patton, Boggs. So I'm an environmental lawyer, basically specialising in all things environmental, climate, sustainability. And I'm delighted to welcome a fantastic panel this morning to talk about how the Yorkshire and Humber region can respond to the challenge of COP26. I have got speaking with me this morning, Nick Baker, who's Deputy Director for Business and Engagement in the COP26 unit. I've got Simon Pringle, who is Yorkshire Climate Commissioner and also an Associate Fellow of Chatham House. I have Emily G, who's a research assistant at Royal Holloway and also an alumni of the University of Sheffield. And just coming online now, we've also got Tom Riordan, who's the CEO of Leeds City Council. So I think just for Tom's been having some problems with audio, which we hopefully will be sorting out in the background. And we'll hopefully, by the time I need to ask Tom a question, he'll be able to speak to us. So before I ask our panelists to introduce themselves, I just wanted to say very quick few words about COP26. I anticipate that probably all of the people listening in this morning will know what it is, but just in case, I just wanted to clarify that what we're talking about here is so it's called COP26 because it is the 26th Conference of the Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So it's a big international climate convention, and the particular significance for COP26, there are several, but this is the moment when we really must finalise what they call the Paris Rulebook. So the framework and the rules under which we're going to meet the targets that were agreed to by the parties to the Paris Agreement in 2015. And another really significant thing is to do with this party's nationally determined contributions. Parties should have submitted their 2030 emissions targets by the end of last year. Not all of them have. And so there's considerable pressure on the parties to bring those targets and put those ambitions forward, and also to increase their ambition. So it's going to be a big meeting in November. So please, can I ask our panelists to briefly introduce themselves, and then we've got some questions that we're going to be discussing. If you do have any questions as we go through, then please feel free to put them in the chat. And if we've got any time at the end, then we will be able to pick those up. So perhaps I could ask Nick if you could introduce yourself briefly, please.
Okay, thanks a lot, Anita, and good morning, everyone. It's great to be here with you today. So my name's Nick Baker. I'm the Deputy Director for Engagement in the COP26 unit. So the COP26 unit is responsible for organising COP26. It's in the Cabinet Office, so in central government, which is the kind of department that coordinates government policy and action. I've been working on COP26 for just over a year now, but by background, I'm actually from the Foreign Office, so I'm a diplomat by training. A big event coming up in November, as Anita said, so we're very busy preparing for that.
Thanks very much, Tom. Emily, perhaps you'd like to go next.
Yep, so I'm Emily G. I graduated from the University of Sheffield last year with an MA in Politics and International Relations. I'm originally from Manchester, but I've lived in Sheffield now for about 5 years. I'm also a research assistant at Royal Holloway, University of London. And while a lot of my work focuses around security issues with gender and feminist studies, there's definitely been a change recently to considering climate change as a legitimate security issue, because it kind of comes under global health, and in the future that's obviously a very, very big issue.
Thanks, Emily. And Simon, perhaps I could ask you to introduce yourself.
Yeah, morning, Anita, and morning, everybody. Great to be here also. So I'm Simon Pringle. I've worked in energy and environment since the early 1990s now, actually. And so my day job is I run a consultancy firm called Project Rome. But outside of that, as Anita mentioned, I'm an associate fellow at Chatham House, and I'm also an honorary professor at the University of Edinburgh Business School. But in this capacity here, I'm here because I'm one of the commissioners of the newly formed sort of Yorkshire and Humber Climate Commission, which we'll probably touch on a bit later on. So I'll look forward to telling you a little bit about that when we get the opportunity later.
Thanks very much, Simon. I think Tom's having some continued issues, but we are hoping to also have Tom Riordan, who's the Chief Executive Officer of Leeds City Council. And I don't think I need to perhaps introduce him any more than that, really. So hopefully we'll be able to bring Tom in due course. I'd like to first of all, I'd really like us to talk a bit about COP26, the main priorities, and why it's so important on different levels. So perhaps Nick, you could kick us off with what's your department focusing on, and what's COP26 going to look and feel like as an event?
Thanks, Anita. Yeah, so my team, as I said at the beginning, is the engagement team, which sounds a little bit vague, but it's working with all non-state actors. So my team works with a very broad range of stakeholders, so business, civil society organizations, NGOs, faith organizations, trade unions, youth organizations, to bring everyone together to contribute towards COP. And the idea behind this is that we have a very good climate change agreement. It's the Paris Agreement that was agreed back in 2015, but we need to implement it. And to implement it, we really need a step change in action on climate change right across society. So that involves not just governments, but business, civil society, all the groups that my team works with, working together, both between sectors, but also internationally, to collaborate to tackle this huge global challenge. So it's a big task. In terms of what COP26 will look and feel like, well, it's taking place in Glasgow at the beginning of November, so from the 1st to the 12th of November. Typically COPs, I have to say I've not been to one. Lots of people obviously in the COP unit have, but it is split into a green zone and a blue zone. And the blue zone is where the negotiations take place. So typically between governments, but not only. And that is for the purposes of the conference UN territory. And you need to be a kind of accredited delegate to be able to access it. But there's a more public-facing side to the event as well, called the Green Zone, which is where a lot of our stakeholders that I've been talking about, business, civil society, youth organizations, will be able to exhibit, will be able to speak about what climate action they're taking, but also the impacts of climate change. Because at COP26, we really want to give a sense of momentum that progress is being made, action is being taken, and look at what is happening and showcasing collaboration, but also why we need to act, that it is urgent, the impacts are happening, the consequences of climate change are already with us, and there it's civil society, youth organizations, indigenous peoples can really have a powerful voice in kind of explaining what the impacts of climate change are, so particularly vulnerable communities. In terms of what we want to get out of COP26, the president designate, so Alok Sharma, gave a speech at the end of last week detailing what we're looking to get out of COP26. And there's 4 key areas. One is mitigation, so that's emissions reductions. And that's securing global net zero by 2050 or earlier if possible, to keep this target of 1.5 degree increase in temperatures within reach. So that's the first goal, is mitigation. The second one is to adapt, to protect communities and natural habitats that are at risk or vulnerable to climate change, and restore ecosystems. That involves building defenses, putting warning systems in place, avoiding loss of homes and livelihoods, all the consequences that we can already see happening. The third goal is to mobilize finance. So to be able to achieve kind of emissions reductions, net zero, and be able to adapt, we need a big increase in finance, and also to make it more accessible so that people who typically can't access finance find it easier. And there's a target that's been set that hasn't yet been reached of $100 billion a year in climate finance provided by the international community. So we need to be able to hit that target and make sure that is accessible. And the final goal is collaboration, because to be able to achieve all of these things, we need to work together. And that's really kind of where my team comes in bringing in business, civil society, youth organizations, and many other people. I should say our team works very closely with Nigel Topping, who you may or may not have heard of, and his team. So he is the high-level champion. He has a UN mandate. So he's appointed by the UK, but he has a UN mandate. And he is working with all the same stakeholders that my team works with, and we work very closely together. So I think as a kind of initial contribution, that's where I'll stop, and happy to kind of come back in later on.
Thanks very much, Nick. So yes, quite a lot to get your teeth into then. And one of the things you mentioned quite a few times was youth groups and the younger generation. And I'd like to bring Emily in now as the youngster on the call. Without wishing to ask you to speak for your entire generation, I just wondered why you thought that COP was important both to you, but also to young people more generally.
Yeah, so, COP, they've got the Youth Summit, which is really important, I think, because at the end of the day, a lot of the impact that climate change is going to have is going to be on younger people. So in 2019, there was an article that came out that said that, like Nick said, the direct effects of climate change, they're already with us. We're seeing specifically, I'll talk about Sheffield because that's where I live. We saw, fires in the Peak Districts. We saw in 2019 the banks of the rivers all flooded and people lost their houses. So that's definitely something that is important to discuss now. But then, the long-lasting effects that are going to affect, younger people, children, rising sea levels, droughts, and uninhabitable areas, it will end up being an issue of housing insecurity, food insecurity, and a range of health conditions. Like we're already seeing that air pollution is such a massive problem in the UK. So I do think that COP is providing an opportunity for young people to be able to speak on the issues that are going to affect them. So I think that is very important.
Very much, Emily. And Simon, perhaps I'll bring you in now to talk about sort of setting COP26 into what I think quite a few people have described as a bit of a super year for international sustainability. So perhaps you could sort of broaden the lens a bit and give us a bit of the bigger picture about what's going on this year.
Yeah, sure, glad to. And just building on the on the input from both Nick and Emily there. Well, it's a really very interesting year, isn't it? And we'll touch briefly on the impacts of the pandemic. But one thing we do know is that the pandemic bumped COP26 a year, which gave Nick and his team an entire extra year to plan for it, which I guess was probably quite welcome, given the distractions that was the distractions of Brexit last year and a whole sequence of geopolitical changes that we've all experienced, most notably the change of administration in the US, and that sets a very different political backdrop, very different political climate to the talks, which I think many would see as really rather helpful. And also within that time, it's allowed countries that may not have been as well prepared, so lower income and middle income countries, to actually prepare for the talks in a more effective way. So there's a hope and expectation that there will be more meaningful discussion because of the extra year that we've accidentally been gifted, if you wish to see it like that, by the impact of the pandemic. But of course, what the pandemic has done is not just bump COP by a year, but it's also bumped a whole sequence of other UN summits as well. So there's been the UN Summit for Food Systems and the UN Biodiversity Summit, which is CBD COP15, I think, and of course the Climate Summit COP26 are all happening this year. And if we think about the interplay between food, biodiversity, and climate, really it's where where three of the most intangible and complex components of our sustainability challenge meet. So having those conferences in the same year is really very, very helpful. it's also the presidency of COP26, as people probably know, is shared between the UK and Italy. Now, the UK government's also chairing the G20 and the G7 meetings this year as well. So we've got G20, G7, and 3 different conferences all happening together. And the discussions, of course, as both Nick and Emily mentioned, are happening in a much more urgent context. I mean, climate science has advanced dramatically since Paris in 2015, and I think people are experiencing climate change rather than just theorizing about it. We know that it's happening. We're experiencing it through changing weather patterns, through extreme events, and those are obviously contextually different in different parts of the world. So this year really does present us with a very urgent opportunity and a crucial test, but also because of the experiences people have had through their daily lives going through the pandemic. One thing we know is that challenges to society are interconnected, that biodiversity and climate and human health are interconnected, but also that change is possible because we've had to change really very significantly, really very quickly, business models, ways of working, ways of interacting, the way in which we consider value creation because of the impacts of the pandemic. So there really is no excuse anymore to say things are too difficult to change, because we've all just experienced a huge amount of change, and we can apply that ambition, I think, to the climate agenda and hopefully respond with the urgency that's required.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Simon. So if we can now perhaps start to talk a bit more about sort of bringing COP down to the regions, what's happening at a more regional and local level, and how people can get involved. And Nick, perhaps if I can come back to you, your team, you talked about outreach and engagement, and that includes business, civil society, youth groups. Could you say a bit more about that sort of outreach work, please?
Sure, Anita. So many of the things that we're asking for in terms of commitments from business, I mean, they apply at the kind of the international level, the national level, and the local level. I mean, very simply, we're asking businesses and cities and other organizations to commit to going net zero by 2050 or earlier, to publish a short to medium term action plan on how they are going to achieve that target. And by short to medium term, I mean 5 to 10 years. So a 5 to 10 year plan, and sign up to something called science-based targets, which are a way of independently assessing and monitoring progress. So how are they doing on meeting their targets and delivering their plan? And if you achieve all that as a business, if you've committed to all of that, you are basically fulfilling the criteria for joining something called the Race to Zero, which is a campaign launched by Nigel Topping's team, so the high-level champion team last year. And that is gathering huge momentum. It's got thousands of businesses signed up to it, cities around the world signing up to it. It's a great campaign, and it's a good way of measuring progress as well, because we can measure numbers of companies that have signed up, or percentage of the GDP of global GDP that is covered by the Race to Zero. So they are simply our asks of business and cities. And once you've kind of made those commitments and putting all those plans in action, and I appreciate many companies and other organizations are already doing a lot of that stuff, is to encourage others to follow your lead, whether it's kind of companies in the supply chain, whether it's business partners, whether it's your encouraging your employees to take climate action, or your customers. There's plenty of influence that businesses can wield. And similarly, cities as well, with the kind of great local contacts that they have with both businesses in their constituencies, but kind of local communities, local civil society organizations, and others. There are some other specific things that we're asking companies and organizations to sign up to as well, that link into some of the COP themes. So I mentioned earlier the goals of what we're trying to achieve, but there's some real focus areas where we think we can have most impact by focusing on those areas. So firstly is clean transport, and there we're really focusing on the transition to electric vehicles, so road transport. and there's an initiative called EV100 that organizations can sign up to. It commits to turning your fleet of vehicles 100% electric. So whether you're a huge organization with a big fleet of vehicles or a kind of a local taxi company, maybe, you can sign up to that. The second area is the power transition. So that is mainly the move away from coal, but it's also increasing uptake of renewable energy. And there's a couple of initiatives that we're supporting. RE100, which is a similar campaign to EV100, where organizations commit to sourcing all their energy from 100% renewable sources, and EP100, which is about energy efficiency, and particularly for buildings. Nature-based solutions is a third area. So that is looking at the impacts of deforestation. So principally the impacts of some big commodities. So beef is one, cocoa, coffee, soy, and palm oil on deforestation, trying to find more sustainable ways of agriculture to mitigate those impacts, and working with companies in the supply chain, but also producer and consumer countries. Talked about finance earlier and increasing access to finance. So that is a big ask, particularly from developing countries and climate vulnerable countries. There is an initiative called Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures that financial companies can sign up to, or companies can sign up to, about climate risk. So all those areas are things that we're focusing on. Adaptation resilience as well, although that is about developing resilience, so things like flood defenses and things like that I was mentioning earlier. And for that, it's increasing finance is really important. So how are we going about this? Well, I mean, there's a whole series of events. It's not just about COP, but it's there's a whole kind of series of events leading up to COP. Simon was talking about the G7 that the UK has the presidency of, so we're using that to try and leverage progress. Italy has the presidency of the G20, so that is very helpful as well. So we've got that kind of the stars aligning this year. There's been lots of progress on a government level, as Simon was saying, kind of the change in the US, but also kind of a series of commitments over the autumn from governments, particularly in Asia. Announcements by China, Japan, South Korea. And we organised a climate ambition summit at the end of last year, in the middle of December, to mark the 5th anniversary of Paris. And there we use that as an opportunity for governments to come forward with new, more ambitious commitments, so these nationally determined contributions, but also to profile commitments from cities, businesses towards net zero, and calls to action from youth organizations, indigenous groups, and civil society organizations. And we'll be doing the similar kind of thing with big events leading up to COP, so London Climate Action Week, New York Climate Week, amongst them, and trying to leverage progress through the G7 and the G20. Finally, on a kind of a local level, we've launched a campaign called the Together for Our Planet campaign, which is an opportunity for local communities, people around the UK, to get involved in climate action and really promote what everyone's doing and get a sense of everyone can contribute and building momentum up to COP. So do get involved in that. We're working with a series of stakeholder groups, a COP26 business leaders, a COP26 mayors and regions council, which brings together all the metropolitan mayors from England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland to advise us on kind of on planning for COP, but also to get involved in COP, and similarly a civil society and youth advisory council. So a lot going on. I'll stop there for now.
Thank you very much, Nick. Wow, yeah, I was just about to say a huge amount going on, and it sounds like a huge amount to be able to get involved in. I'm delighted that Tom has been able to join us. Hello, Tom, and welcome. And
Hi, Anita.
Perhaps I could turn the floor over to you for a moment, since you haven't had the chance yet. So by all means, please feel free to make some sort of more general introductory remarks if you'd like to, because you didn't get the chance to do that earlier, to sort of to introduce yourself. I did introduce you, but I'm sure you could do a much better job. But I did want to ask you as well, Tom, about, building on from what Nick said, what about Leeds? What about business and community engagement with the Leeds area and how you're approaching it? So perhaps you could say a few words. Thanks.
Thanks, Anita. Solving climate change is quite easy after having navigated the technological problems we've just had with Caitlin and Sarah. So thank you to them. And apologies for being a little bit late. I've been with this agenda for many, many years. I started my career working in the Department of the Environment in London, and was part of the team that produced the first ever UK climate action plan. Back in the early 90s. It was actually the first climate change action plan in the world. And it was a direct response to the Rio Convention and the Climate Change Convention at the time. It had a great chapter that I helped write, which was called Beyond 2000, which seemed like a very long time away. I participated in UN and OECD negotiations. It brought home very clearly to me the role that we play in the world, and the type of negotiations that will be happening later this year, whereby, it's important to remember when you're talking to what were then called the developing countries, but I think have developed incredibly, since then, that, we deforested as a country many hundreds of years ago, to get industry going in the country, and countries across the world, just as the developed world has done that, they end up telling the rest of the world that they can't do so because of a scientific problem that their scientists have identified. We've come a long way since then, and I think there is, particularly I think with the new US administration, a fantastic opportunity with this COP to take us further. In the middle of my career, I worked at a regional level, and through Yorkshire Forward developed a number of initiatives on carbon capture and storage in South Yorkshire, on offshore wind out in the east, and it's been fantastic to see those come to fruition more recently, and the work done through the universities in the Advanced Manufacturing Park down in South Yorkshire, trying to build lighter planes to use less fuel. Aircraft emissions is a huge issue for everybody, and it's one that hasn't been dealt with ever since that time that I was dealing with the conference of the parties work. And so, there's much more to be done. Bringing it back to now, the here and now, the last 11 years I've worked in Leeds, and we've been working really hard to make a reality of our ambitions. We want to be carbon neutral by 2030, which is an incredibly ambitious target. But we've already got the greenest fleet in the country, with a second biggest council, and we've got hundreds of electric vehicles now. We've introduced an energy for waste plant in the city, so that we are recycling much more of our waste, and much less of it goes to landfill, and we reuse the heat that's produced from that to basically put heat, carbon-free heat, into our city centre. And we've developed a district heating scheme that is now halving the cost of fuel bills for some of the poorest people in the city, and replacing the old boilers with heat pumps, which are making a huge difference to people's lives, and are also reducing our carbon emissions as a city. That district heating network is going to be rolled out even further to the south of the station on the South Bank, and it's continuing north and proving incredibly popular with developers and landowners, because it effectively decarbonises their energy bills and breaks the link between the cost of oil and the cost of their fuel bills, so it makes sense economically too. We are doubling the amount of forest coverage that we've got in this and we've started that with the White Rose Forest Partnership, and that will continue. We're working on the whole catchment area after we were hit by Storm Eva, the best and most vivid example and tragic example of climate change that hit us on Boxing Day back in 2015. We are working to put in two flood alleviation schemes that basically go right up to the source of the River Aire and plant trees in Craven and Bradford districts. So we're working collaboratively on that. And we're encouraging businesses to join us in this endeavour and communities to join us in this endeavour. There's never been a better time to take action. You know, we'll never get it completely right. There are big challenges for us. People still want to travel abroad. They still want to go on holiday. And if we just shut down our airport, as some people would like us to do, I'm afraid that would lead to more carbon emissions because people would travel further to other airports to travel. It would also penalise poorer people it would be more expensive for them to go on holiday. So we've got to come up with a solution globally and nationally to aircraft emissions and to how we deal with airports. And that's one of the real headaches and conundrums that we're dealing with at the moment. But, you know, great stuff that's happened. The clean air zone that we were going to bring in has led to hugely improved decarbonised taxi and private hire fleets because of the grant scheme that the government put in place. So we now don't need that clean air scheme to hit the legal targets. So there's lots and lots that can be done and lots more to do. I'll leave it there, Anita, but hopefully that gives you a flavour of what we bring to the table as Leeds.
Thank you very much, Tom. Yeah, it certainly does. And perhaps Simon, if you could now again broaden, I keep asking you to broaden out the discussion. Could you perhaps comment on the wider Yorkshire and Humber regional perspective, please?
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. I think that was a great intro to that from Tom, because, you know, as he knows, he and I have worked on this agenda in Leeds. So I mentioned earlier, but I sit on the LEP board and have chaired the Green Economy panel for Leeds City Region for some time. So I can vouch for everything Tom's been talking about. There's been a lot of hard work gone in. And what's also happened in Leeds, and I am going to move away from there, but what's also happened in Leeds is there's been a climate commission put together for the city, which was under the leadership of Professor Andy Goulson, who I think is speaking at a later slot on this conference. And he really did, you know, he took the learning from the Stern report and brought together a city scale Stern report. That was a sort of economic impact of climate change report for those who are not familiar. And that was met with great success. Also what happened was a big engagement process, a big conversation with the communities in Leeds about climate change. And the reason I'm mentioning that is because what it brought him to, and a group of others from different sectors, different backgrounds, was a recognition that we've got climate commission focus at a national scale and we've got commission style focus at a city scale, both of those really important, but scale's key in creating different types of partnerships and different types of leverage to address the challenges that Nick particularly was articulating earlier. And the feeling was that operating at a regional scale would give us, you know, different levers to pull and different influence to create around some of the, you know, the really more complex challenges, whether that's crowding in finance into the schemes that are required to adapt or to bring resilience into play, or critically for the Yorkshire and Humber region, looking at those nature-based solutions. And we've already got some great examples of those. I mean, we just looked at some of the partnership working that Yorkshire Water have been doing with the National Trust, looking at upland landscapes and the way in which those are protected and the biodiversity improved, or looking in Hull and the Humber region. There's a Living with Water partnership, again, that Yorkshire Water is right at the centre of. Hull being, after Hamburg, I think one of the most vulnerable cities to flooding in Europe because of its relative height against sort of tidal heights, and the ability to create real leverage by partnering different organisations together and looking at how land use choices are made, looking at how housing is planned, housing is developed, how technologies are deployed, but also how behavioural aspects can be brought to bear. Really, really key. Jumping somewhere else in the region, so the circular economy is being led out of York and North Yorkshire, and a huge opportunity to look at the way that the rural economy can be made more sustainable, both economically and environmentally sustainable, which are big social impacts. And so you can see just from those examples that there are things going on in all corners of the region already. And the role of the commission is not to set targets, it's not to hold people accountable. Really, it's working bottom up. It's there to encourage, to support, to provide a little bit of drive and connectivity in certain areas, and also to recognise that there's a potential economic consequence, a very positive economic consequence of getting this right. But I'd just like to make a mention of the just transition, and the need to really manage carefully the transition to a low and then a zero carbon economy, because there will be certain sectors that just don't make that transition, and there will be economic impacts that are felt amongst often poorer communities if we don't do that job well. So the just transition is a key focus for the Commission, as well as, of course, playing our role in creating some positive impacts around mitigation, adaptation, and resilience.
Thank you, Simon. Yes, it's a very, very important point to mention. And Emily, so maybe building on that point about just transition and the next generation, how should we be engaging with younger people? So we being potentially, well, I suppose, older people, but also the governments and businesses, to get them involved in this kind of regional change and these initiatives we've been talking about.
So I think the main thing for at least most of the people that I know is affordability. Now, when someone is paying rent and it's £600-700 in rent, you can't usually afford, an electric car, which, unless there's some kind of government grant, you're looking at around £44,000 for the average electric car, which I couldn't afford. But certain schemes, such as like when I was at university, there was a £1 bus scheme, and that would be the difference between someone using a taxi, you just jump on the bus. So things like that, like affordability is definitely, a big factor. But I think my generation's always been kind of aware of climate change. Like throughout school, you're told to reduce, reuse, recycle, like walk, don't get a car and stuff like that. But I think recently there's definitely been a shift towards being active instead of just knowing about it. So although it seems kind of, it doesn't seem that big an issue, vegan food is very popular at the moment, and in Yorkshire alone there's around 80 cafes and restaurants that are just vegan food. But a study from Oxford said that if you were to have a vegan based diet, or even 50% vegan diet, then you've got a 73% chance of reducing your carbon footprint. So little changes like that definitely do make a difference, because as Nick mentioned earlier, like in particular meat production and deforestation around that, it's such a heavy polluter, and the meat and dairy production industries cause around 60% of agricultural greenhouse gases. So making small changes like switching to vegan, it can definitely help. And I feel like my generation, I feel like everybody's got the opportunity to do that, but specifically a lot of people my age are making that shift. So yeah, definitely affordability and making small changes.
Yeah. Thanks, Emily. I think that's really important to not to overlook or to minimise the effect of all those multiple, what you say, small changes, but they can have a big combined effect. So we have not got very long left, and I was hoping we might be able to pick up on a couple of the chats, but I did want to just ask everyone, so perhaps if I could ask you to be ever so brief. I did want to just quickly get some comments from everybody looking sort of forwards, really. So after COP26, how can we harness the momentum and really continue that drive for real change? So yeah, if I could ask you to be ever so brief, that would be brilliant. But Tom, perhaps if I could come to you first, sort of, looking forward after COP.
Yeah, thank you, Anita. And I thought Emily spoke really well about the affordability question, which we as a council always are very aware of. Because we have to think about the whole city and all its communities. And certainly my daughter talks to me about the exactly the same issues that Emily talked about in terms of the vegan agenda and the issues of land use. And I think that's in that longer term box of issues that we definitely need to keep moving forward on, and a great sustainable food movement in the city that's growing, that we'd want to be part of. I think the other area I would mention is domestic heating, which is probably the biggest conundrum, where, you know, the potential move to hydrogen is something that we've been working on with the H21 project, with Northern Gas Networks and others, and we're going to have to work with industry. Leeds would be a great place to do it because of the nature of the city and the nature of our pipe work that's been put in. Transport is a massive issue. We have aspirations for a mass transit system, and we've worked through the pandemic to put £165 million of transport investment in, which is helping to reduce our carbon footprint. We've got to make buses more affordable for people in this city, to get them to switch in the way that, you know, Emily said. If you can make it affordable, people will use public transport. I think the whole thing, to keep it brief, is just to keep working together. The Climate Commission that we've set up has been brilliant. Andy's chaired it brilliantly. We've got the Yorkshire one now with Liz Barber involved. We've got to recognise that we're all in this together, and we're going to take different positions, but, you know, we're going to fall out at times. There are going to be things that we can't do as a council, as a government, but we've just got to keep moving forward and accelerating our work on this, because it is of a much higher priority than it ever was, and we owe it to the future generations to get it right.
Thanks, Tom. And Emily, are there any activities that you're involved in or that you'd like to see, inspired by COP? Is there anything you'd like to add? I mean, you've already talked about a few things.
Yeah, I think in Sheffield, I've always followed the tree felling issue, because, you know, you've got people on one side that say that the trees are either disruptive or they're actually dying, they've got disease, but on the other side, these trees have been here for years and years and years, much longer than we have. So things like that, I think, are just things that you see every day. And, you know, I wouldn't hold my hands up and say I'm specifically a climate change activist, but it's definitely something that we're seeing more of in everyday life. It's not just an issue that, you know, it'll be 2050, it's far down the line. It's something that's happening now. So a lot of the stuff you see is just generally inclusive of that. But I think in the future, we just need to keep having these conversations and giving young people a voice so they can actually say what is worrying them and what they think should be on the agenda in the future. But keeping it accessible as well, and make sure there's, you know, awareness raising in schools, and start from a younger age so that people can kind of grow up with this at the front of the mindset, rather than, you know, just being kind of on the peripheral.
Thanks, Emily. And Simon, in very few words, if you can you comment on sort of micro versus macro changes? So, and you know, is one going to be more important than the other?
Yeah, I'll be as brief as possible. Well, I think, you know, hearing both from Tom and from Emily and what Nick was saying earlier, we know that they need to work in combination. I think it's right that they do. We do have some very substantial sort of infrastructure scale challenges, anticipating the infrastructure required for, you know, electrified vehicles, for example, or decarbonising heat, as Tom was referring to. Those are big agendas. Carbon capture and storage, big agendas too. But also, you know, personal choices, and I think community level sort of activity is really important, because that's the way that people can actually experience the potential benefits of working on climate related projects, and get health and well-being benefits from that too. But the one thing I think we really must do in terms of building momentum and maintaining momentum from COP is to sell as positive a vision as to what we could gain by decarbonising the economy and addressing climate, rather than the things that we might have to lose or leave behind, and selling a positive vision of the future and what society, you know, could be like if we successfully make the transition that we need to. I think that's what's going to inspire people and allow people to start translating it into their own businesses, their own personal life, the different choices that they make, and the communities that they live in. If we can pull that trick off, I think we've got a really good opportunity of capitalising fully on the benefits of COP26.
Thanks, Simon. Yeah, I think the kind of the positive messaging is yeah, so it's much easier to sell, isn't it? And finally, Nick, you've already talked to us about a lot of the sort of fantastic initiatives that there are, but can we have a sort of final, what would your takeaway advice be to a Yorkshire business who wanted to get more involved?
I mean, all those points are great points. So Simon, on the fact that this is an opportunity as well as a risk, I think very much so. There's huge opportunities in adapting to climate change and business opportunities. Tom, in working together and the importance of collaboration between sectors, but kind of internationally as well. And Emily, about the kind of the importance of small changes. Everyone can make a difference on a kind of their own level. So I think all those points are great. For businesses, I would just reiterate that kind of the things that we're asking: commit to net zero by 2050 or earlier, join the race to zero. There's an SME climate hub if you're a smaller company that helps you do that. Collaborate with others, universities, civil society organizations, cities. But the main thing is, I think net zero is the future, and it's a huge opportunity. So seize it.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you. And a very upbeat finish to our debate this morning. And I'm terribly sorry that we haven't got time to go through questions and things in the chat, but all the panel can see those, I think. So if there are questions that are directed to particular panelists, I think they might have the opportunity to be able to respond to you offline. I'm not entirely sure how that works, but I'm sure we can work that out and deal with any burning questions. So I'd just like to say thank you very much to Emily, Nick, Simon and Tom for joining me this morning. It's been a really interesting debate, and looking forward to seeing what else there is to discuss later on today. Thank you very much, everybody. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.